Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Okay, so did I miss anything? Of course not. When it comes to relevant information, the black media doesn't miss a trick. And I know that there are people who want my take on Don Lemonade's failed partnership with Elon Musk. I'll be giving him that work tomorrow, but for today I want to address something else, and I think it may surprise you where this one is going. Now, recently you've had a ruling from a judge out of Texas that has attacked a federal agency. Now, this federal agency is called the Minority Business Development Agency. It was created in the 1970s under the Nixon administration, believe it or not, and their purpose is supposed to be to help non-white groups get business funding, which of course they're not able to get because of racial discrimination. So because of all of these whites-only policies, all of these whites-only good old boy networks, the federal government decided to step in. At least that was the idea on paper. Now, this agency has been around for over a half century now. There's nothing new about it. It's not as if nobody knew about it. But what you have going on, of course, is the white rights would-be anti-black culture war, and this happens to be part of it. They're trying to attack private organizations who happen to give money to black groups, or if you have federal government organizations who do the same thing. Now, in holistic terms, this is basically a bunch of mega millionaires and billionaires who are using their money to fund these nuisance suits. And this is supposed to be nothing more than a feel-good exercise for them, because that's the entire point. But before we go any further, let's get one thing straight. The so-called Minority Business Development Agency doesn't just cater to minorities. Did you know that? It also accepts applications from and gives money to white applicants too. Now, white people are not minorities. In fact, this organization was created specifically because white people in America are the only ones, by and large, who can get their hands on any sort of business development money. Now, keep in mind, it was white businessmen who filed this lawsuit, and even wealthier white businessmen who are the ones behind all of these flurry of nuisance suits. So when you start talking about people being competitive in business, who do you think doesn't like that? The judge himself in this case admits that he knows full well that this agency has also catered to and given money to white applicants, but he says he wants it to serve people regardless of race, even though the agency is already doing exactly that. And just to show that this guy is clearly part of the white right agenda, he doesn't even bother to try to vary up the talking points. He claims the same thing that you've had the rest of these guys doing, saying that, well, the Constitution's Fifth Amendment equal protection guarantee means that this organization shouldn't exist because it presumes that racial minorities are inherently disadvantaged. Now, keep in mind, the judge didn't actually bother to say or to prove or to demonstrate or to document that minorities are not disadvantaged. He doesn't show that there's no opportunity gaps between whites and non-whites. He doesn't do that at all. Instead, he says, something Fifth Amendment. Something inherently disadvantaged. Yes, sounds just like Ron DeSantis and the clowns down in Florida, doesn't it? That's how you know that these guys are all operating out of the same playbook. This is not just happenstance. Agencies like these came into being precisely because the courts have been a toilet of white right-wing extremist ideologues like this judge. The courts have been the main places where they have ignored the Constitution and they just hand down rulings based on their personal biases and prejudices, like with this case. And that's because these judges, they have their appointments for life. They're unelected. That means that they're not scared that the voters are going to put them out, and by and large, they're not scared of being punished either. That's a problem. This judge contradicts himself left and right. In one breath, he says that white applicants have to prove they're not advantaged. What he, of course, conveniently leaves out is that even the non-white applicants also have to prove that they need the money. See, that agency doesn't just hand out money or help to any and everyone. In fact, where black people are concerned, it's not doing that much to begin with. More on that in a moment. Now, the judge basically said, I'm white and I say so. He doesn't demonstrate that minorities are no more disadvantaged than whites. He doesn't say anything about that at all. His ruling is just verbal diarrhea that reads like a Stormfront or Yahoo comment section. Quotes like, 2 wrongs don't make a right, and the MBDA's racial presumption is a wrong. And that the agency's been using the unconstitutional presumption for 55 years too many. Today the clock runs out. Does that sound like a judge explaining his ruling, or does it sound like some sawed-off right-wing nut auditioning for a segment on Fox News? I mean, these guys let it all hang out. They put on full display that as far as they're concerned, this is the white lash. This is the evil empire striking back. That there has always been blatant, rampant, unquestionable racism and discrimination when it comes to business funding, especially from these banks, that's not even a question. Not too long ago, I documented on this very channel about how the U.S. federal government, of all places, successfully sued a number of banks due to redlining. These banks in the 2020s got caught showing that they had their little maps and everything, and if you're black, you're not going to get any sort of loan from them. Part of the U.S. government's lawsuits against those redlining banks requires them to actually start doing right and actually start doing loans with non-white people. Though the government did go out of its way to specify that these banks need to make the effort to do business with non-English speakers, specifically those who speak Spanish. That was actually part of their settlement. So since redlining clearly hadn't gone away, you had federal regulators who made it clear that these banks are going to be required to do business with non-white people. And in a development that shocks absolutely no one, the banks are now suing the federal regulators and saying you're overstepping your bounds by telling us that we can't discriminate. Maybe that little racist inbred down in Texas, someone should tell him about this. See, this is the reason why the Minority Business Development Agency exists. This is the reason why organizations like it were created and the legislation that went along with it. Precisely because of these kind of policies, these kind of practices by the private sector, which the judge didn't have anything to say about. See, that's what they do when they tell their lies by omission. The judge didn't explain how the banks and such were doing right by black people. What the judge said instead was that white people are not inherently advantaged. That's what he was saying. That's lying by omission. He doesn't explain to you what it is that the banks are doing. He doesn't address any of that. He just pretends like none of that's happening. All that matters is what the federal government's doing. The federal government was making a response to the white supremacist discrimination and racism going on in the society. And we still see it today. Here you have these white banks and organizations fighting for their right to racially discriminate. Where's Ed Blum at? Oh, that's right. Ed Blum works for the very millionaires and billionaires who are sitting here suing the government, who are saying we want to make sure that we can continue to discriminate with impunity. And you'll have judges like that little inbred down in Texas who will be saying, well, when you think about it, it's actually constitutional. Yeah. Or better yet, they'll just be remaining silent because this is the status quo that they want. That's what all of these little lawsuits that they've been filing have been geared toward. The entire problem that they had was that there was any sort of effort to try to, at least on its face, to balance the scales. And this is all about trying to push back against that, to impede that, to stymie that, to outlaw it. That's what they were trying to get to. This is what they're trying to support. But this judge doesn't say anything about that, does he? Of course not. He doesn't try to actually defend what he says. He just gives some verbal vomit and then moves on. But this clown is a Trump appointee. What do you expect? Team reflects leadership. This goofball wasn't put on the bench because he knows the law. Obviously, he doesn't. And he has nothing but contempt for the Constitution. He's on the bench because the white right 40 years ago embarked on this project to take over the federal judiciary as their last ditch. They did this as their plan to attack the few seeming reforms in regards to race that had taken place in America in the previous 20 years. See, the white right knew that they couldn't win at the ballot box or in the state legislatures. So trying to use right-wing extremists on the bench to legislate in the courtroom, this has been their strategy. Now, this ruling in practical terms doesn't mean an enormous amount because the agency already gives money to white applicants as it is. And the judge on this case acknowledged that, but as the white media admits, these lawsuits are not about what they seem to be about on the surface. They're part of a larger overarching agenda by the white right to blatantly, openly legalize anti-black discrimination. That's what this is actually meant to do. That's why they keep using the phrase, all of these non-white read black people, they're not disadvantaged at all. No one's disadvantaging them, and there's no, you can't say that you're disadvantaged or oppressed. That's the point that they're trying to reach, because they think if they do enough rulings like that, that apparently that will make it where no one can say that except for them, which is the entire point. White supremacy believes in taking both sides of the conversation. Thank you, Neely Fuller. This lawsuit is one of the asinine anti-black culture war suits that these white right lunatics have been pushing. I've told you that these are not the results of any grassroots actions. This is the result of wealthy white conservatives who are mega millionaires and billionaires, and they use their billions to invent these phony sock puppet groups who put out these lawsuits. This is how you get Christopher Rufo. He works for the Manhattan Institute, or Ed Blum, who is affiliated with a number of right-wing think tanks. And in this latest case of AstroTurf litigation, it's the result of a right-wing group out of Wisconsin calling itself the Institute for Law and Liberty. These guys have quite the sense of humor, don't they? They claim in the names of their little groups that they're about law when they're actually about ignoring the law. They're about liberty when they're actually about fascism and imprisoning people. These guys are all about subjugating the society, not freeing it. Now, normally these little right-wing sock puppet groups, they're not actually this far involved in these things, but you had a precedent that was set with the Koch brothers with Citizens United. These white right billionaires, these oligarchs, these guys figured out decades ago that simply throwing millions of dollars at these politicians wasn't going to be sufficient to bring about the kind of societal changes that they wanted. They were going to have to actually take a hands-on approach and do this one personally. Now, these public policy institutes, normally what they do is they just manufacture so-called reports and documents that are nothing more than thinly veiled rubber stamping of their putrid ideology. They usually don't go this far, but the rich white ideologues who fund these organizations, they don't want to have to come out of the shadows and expose themselves because that makes them targets. But the problem is they fail to get things done. And on top of that, it's been the voters themselves who have been handing these guys so many L's. That's who this war is actually against. For the longest time, the white right in particular has griped that they simply can't get their way at the ballot box. Statewide referendums have become the bane of the GOP's existence, and I don't just mean the recent abortion state ballot initiatives either. In Michigan years ago, when the illegal and unconstitutional city manager scheme was first passed by the GOP-controlled legislature in that state, the voters of Michigan organized a ballot referendum in which they overthrew this would-be city manager scheme, which everyone recognizes as a city takeover scheme. But the GOP-controlled legislature came back immediately afterwards, and they passed the same law, or rather laws. They took the exact same idea, broke it up into pieces, and passed them individually to do the exact same thing. And the Obama administration did nothing about it. Also in Florida, voters there passed a state referendum removing the Jim Crow policy of preventing people who had been incarcerated from felonies from voting. This was in blood-red Florida where this successfully happened. And the Republican-controlled legislature in Florida was furious with this development because their own Republican voters helped to pass a law that would make it harder for those very same Republicans to get into elected office. It would make it harder for them to maintain their artificial grip on power in that state. Of course, it was then DeSantis who in his first term introduced the scam of requiring that anyone who was reapplying for voter registration in Florida couldn't do so without paying all the state fees associated with their incarceration. So in these blood-red states, the Republicans keep getting their teeth kicked in, and by their own voters in many cases. And this is why they've been on a jihad to get federal judgeships, and of course to make sure that they put the youngest legal hacks that they can on the bench. That's what they've been trying to do. But there's also another aspect of this case that needs to be spoken about. Now, this organization claims to be all about minority business development, and black people certainly are the object here. We're certainly the targets here. But when it comes to how this organization operates, we're not the subject. You see, in 2022, this agency said that it helped to raise more than $50 million for black-owned businesses. But that was only a drop in the bucket compared to the over $395 million that it raised for Hispanic-owned businesses. Now, isn't that interesting? Although the number of black and Hispanic residents in the U.S. is about the same, the federal government, however, helped to raise 8 times as much money for Hispanic businesses as for black ones. Before anyone gets dewy-eyed about this agency, just keep in mind there is a case to be made that it racially discriminates. But it doesn't discriminate against white people. So, as we saw with affirmative action, here you had yet another organization, in this case a federal agency, that makes sure that, we're going to be helping out a lot of non-white people, but black people are going to be at the very end of it. They'll get the crumbs that are left over. We got to prioritize everyone else. The entire reason that these organizations and agencies even exist is specifically because of the racism that black people have faced. Black people are the ones who face redlining. Black people are the ones who have these bank managers and all of these executives at these lending institutions who brag they don't give money to black people, and they also make it a point that they're going to be harming black people's communities every chance they get, targeting us with the infrastructure. Every time they build a new highway, every time they build a new roadway, they make sure to run it straight through a black neighborhood. And of course, Joe Biden, he decided there needed to be a massive infrastructure bill. Oh, by the way, when he made this organization permanent, that was part of the infrastructure bill. Kinda ironic, don't you think? But your so-called Minority Business Development Association gives the lion's share of its support and funding to anyone except for black people. That's what you need to understand about this. This is why Claude Anderson said, don't be running around calling yourself a minority. We need to say specifically black. Because when you decide that you're going to let yourself be put under the umbrella term of minority, this is what you get. It becomes the same old bait and switch, the same old scam. And even if you want to selectively overlook that, you still can't overlook the fact that this is not happening in a vacuum. This is happening actually with Democrat support. Things like the Fearless Fund are more targeted towards black business owners, and yes, I'm aware of the faux feminist leanings of the Fearless Fund's leaders. They're certainly on that black girls rock kick, and they push blatant gender division in the black community. But my point is that for all their faults, it doesn't change the fact that they're not a clumsy front for another lift-all-boats scheme, and they're not governmental either. And yet you've had people like Ed Blum targeting them with lawsuits claiming that the money they give constitutes a contract. See, this is the white right trying to invent a flimsy legal pretense for a lawsuit. They know that they don't actually have grounds for it, but the entire point is to intimidate people, scare people. That's what it's actually about. Oh, these guys will gin up some nuisance suit against you, and it's going to cost a lot of money for you to predictably have them beaten in court. Sure, you'll beat them in court, but it's going to cost you a lot of money. Meanwhile, the millionaires and mega billionaires that actually fund these little organizations that Ed Blum works for, these guys are getting all sorts of tax breaks, tax cuts, loopholes, tax deferments. The federal government's bending over backwards to fund these guys and make sure that they keep as much money as possible, which they then weaponize against the black community. That's what these guys are actually doing. They know that that's what these lawsuits actually are. They also know that these things are in the long run damned to failure. There's nothing about the money that Freedom Fund gives that constitutes a contract to anyone. A contract is quid pro quo, something in return for something else. Fearless Fund's recipients aren't doing anything for Fearless Fund. They give them money simply because they're black, which is their prerogative. They're a private entity. It's their money. Under Blum's asinine assertion, however, that's a contract. He also claims that a scholarship is a contract too. These are the lies and the flimsy pretenses that they're trying to use. And it's not that these judges don't know, it's that these people all work for the exact same white interest. These judges coming out of the Federalist Society, these are the same organizations funded by the exact same wealthy white ideologues who fund the Ed Blums and the Christopher Rufos, etc. This is about weaponizing lawsuits to intimidate and coerce people. That's what they hope to ultimately do. That's the goal that they're trying to reach. Now, normally people like Blum would have been deemed vexatious litigants, which is what they are, but there's a program at work here and both political parties are complicit. As we've seen nationwide, the white right's ability to win elections has gone from eroding to outright evaporating. We've also seen them put aside all pretense that they were anything other than white supremacists. They're lying huge, as Christopher Rufo himself admitted, and their plan was to install these far-right ideologues from the Federalist Society, which should be illegal in and of itself, because they're clearly a political group who has taken an oath to ignore the law in favor of their own personal racial biases. That's the definition of political high-handedness when you do that stuff, and it's unconstitutional, it's against the law. And any of these judges who are part of the Federalist Society, or have ever had any sort of associations with them, they should be impeached and removed from office on that basis. The Democrats could do it, and there would be very little risk that their own left-leaning judges would face any substantive widespread reprisals from the Republicans, because most of those left-leaning judges, they're not part of any sort of secret unconstitutional cabals. But the Democrats aren't going to do that because, as I've explained for 15 years now, the white left and the white right actually cooperate with and play off of each other, especially where black people are concerned. The Republicans do white power's dirty work, and the Democrats try to trick you into sitting on your hands while they do it. As we saw with Joe Biden recently, you had that Supreme Court case dealing with police being sued for not giving someone their Miranda rights. Biden had no dog in that fight. That lawsuit was between a black immigrant and a Hispanic cop. The federal government was not a party to the case, but that didn't stop Biden from taking the almost unprecedented step of having his own Solicitor General write a court brief to the Trump-appointed dominated Supreme Court, telling them that the Biden administration wanted them to rule in favor of the police. When Biden said that he would have black America's back, yeah, he meant that, because that's where he would put the knife. All of you Biden bots out there, this is what you voted for. Someone who will go to the mat to protect dirty cops, and who will do and say nothing while the white right attempts to do an end run around the Constitution and the few meaningful laws that we've had passed to try to make some aspects of this country's operation resemble something like a democracy. You didn't see Biden or the Democrats upset about this ruling at all, did you? Even though it attacks the executive branch of government, that's Biden's branch. Why is Biden not bothered by this? Well, maybe it has something to do with the fact that in 2021, the year Biden took office, this same judge, Mark Pitman, was petitioned by President Biden to strike down one of the anti-abortion laws that had been passed in Texas. And in that ruling, Pitman wasn't bombastic or asinine with his wording. He was uncharacteristically subdued and reasonable. Now, this guy is racist trash who shouldn't be on the bench, but you see how you had two rulings by the exact same judge dealing with the exact same president. And although one of those rulings directly attacks Biden's administration directly, the White House doesn't seem bothered by it. Yeah, because Pitman can be counted on to rule the right way on things that actually matter to the white left. The United States has never had a democracy a moment in its existence, and it has been soaked in racism from before its founding. When some white right-wing racist tries to tell you the spiel about how racism isn't a problem, your first question should always be, tell me the exact year when racism ended in America. And you can also tell me where in America racism is not practiced, where it doesn't exist. They can tell you when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. They can tell you when the Civil War ended, the dates of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act's passage. So it should be child's play for them to answer when racism ended, right? But they can't, because racism never has. And for each and every law that was allegedly passed to address the oppression that we face, there has always been a tsunami of white legislation to attack those laws and undermine them. See, that's a crucial point that's never mentioned when some Ben Shapiro or Thomas Sowell wannabe trots out the old, "Oh, but we dealt with racism a long time ago" line. This country has been saying that for 150 years, and it's never been true even once. So when this judge claims that two wrongs don't make a right, he's ignoring that the wrong is the historical legislative oppression that we've had to contend with, and that he is a part of. I want you to remember this case going into the election. You're going to have a lot of bought and paid for Negroes online and on the air trying to tell you Biden's done so much for black people, and why if you let that mean old Trump get back into the White House, the Republicans are going to have a free hand and they're going to use it to roll back every alleged beneficial government program, initiative, and policy that's ever been passed. Well, tell me something. How is that any different than what Biden's doing right now? Remaining silent, as he has with this case, or worse, using the bully pulpit of the presidency to promote and advocate for legal rulings meant to target us, as he did with that Miranda case. How is any sort of alleged bad dealing from Trump different than what Biden's doing now? Now, this is not to say that Trump is better than Biden. He's not, and that's the point. You're not choosing the lesser of two evils, you're just choosing evil. You see Republicans across the board doing this culture war crap, all of this message legislation, and you don't see Democrats anywhere saying, wait a minute here, you're attacking the base of our party. You're attacking the black community here, so we're going to start passing laws specifically meant to target you. You don't see any sort of legislative reprisals or retaliation on their part, and that's deliberate. See, when it comes to abortion, they go to the mat. We're going to have statewide referendums in these red states. Oh, they become fearless about it. When it came to gay marriage, they reached across the aisle and said, well, we got to get that gay marriage law passed. But when it comes to black people, crickets. When someone says they've got your back, that also means they don't let people think they can just attack you. Everyone knows that these nuisance suits by these right-wing think tanks are actually attacks on the black community. Everyone knows that. But your Democrats, your so-called president, won't even call this out, and neither will these mouthpieces for him. And the people who get upset about these lawsuits, they tend to get upset about the wrong things. See, if Biden ever does decide to lower himself to commenting on this, what he and his little Negro sock puppets will do is say, well, look, Biden made this organization permanent. He made the agency permanent. And he put some money behind it, and see, he's doing this for you. I've already explained to you. They do very little for black people. This agency spends the bulk of its time and its resources making sure that everybody else is taken care of. They ignore black people by and large. So when they come up to you and say, oh, there's something, we're going to be lifting all boats. This is what they're talking about. Everybody else is going to be having a yacht, and you're going to be having a dinghy raft. If that, more than likely, you'll have a life preserver with a hole in it. That's what the actual lift all boats means. And this is the reason why you need the black media. Not just telling you what's happening, but also peeling back the layers so you can understand the reality of what of your interest is truly at stake. And while you have every right to be outraged about these legislative attacks because we know that black people are the targets of them, just keep in mind, your Democratic leadership is not doing anything about it. Your Congressional Black Caucus, where the hell are they at to tell Biden, if you don't start moving against this, in fact, to tell Hakeem Jeffries, supposed to have a black man who's supposed to be the leader of the Democratic Party in Congress now, and he's not even saying boo about this. What does that tell you? As far as they're concerned, there's a very beneficial purpose that's being served by allowing the Republicans to carry out these attacks against the black community, because the black community has become disobedient. We've been making demands that are putting pressure on white supremacy, so they're going to need the Republicans to go ahead and do the dirty work of pushing back against the Negras. That's what this is actually about. Well, believe it or not, the black community actually gets to have a say in this too. We have a ruling of our own that gets handed down when these kind of things happen, and when it comes to our rulings, there's no appeal. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Bo Eldridge McLean, Suleiman Alaji, D. Tubman, Angela Merritt, and Stephen 12. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.